an unadulterated gold standard is ruling out this business of borrowing short to lend long. Or in other words, it rules out the illicit interest arbitrage. So that's part of it. And it wasn't done. It was not ruled out. Even some Austrian economists defended on the grounds that if you can put these bills into circulation illicitly, well, if the market takes it, so that's, the market is the boss. However, that's like saying, well, if you can get away with fraud, then it's perfectly legal, right? As long as you are not caught. The problem is getting caught. So this is part of the notion.
I was going to say, I have some gold-colored tungsten I'm going to be willing to sell $1,370 an ounce.
Right. I realize we need to break, but thank you very much for that. But would I be correct in saying that that aspect of what an unadulterated gold standard means has never existed?
Has never?
Has never existed?
No, not in a legal sense. And that was a mistake. It should have been ruled out legally.
No, but what I mean is what you are saying should be ruled out legally, should be ruled out as a legal trade, was never ruled out. Was it ever ruled out? Banks have always done that, right?
No, it wasn't. And that was the...
Don't forget, this was around before banks, and the illicit stuff came in later. And this is part of the carry trade today. It's the same issue. Rolling over short-term debt to meet the long-term obligations. And the day comes you cannot roll it over, then what happens? That's when the system seizes up. And that's why it's illicit. Because it's risk. It's putting the whole system at risk. Borrowing short to lend long. Okay, we'll continue on after.
I'll be happy to go back.
You want to go back in time?
I'm just going to put this on.
So it's a beautiful Auckland day, except for when it's not. Difficult. Today, Professor Fekete will be the lecturer, but before we begin, as per the program, Rudy wants to follow up on some of the unanswered questions of yesterday, maybe a few minutes. Rudy.
Thank you. I don't get sleep sometimes thinking about the questions. Some people had some issues about interest, and the topic came up that interest is wrong because all this money lent out commands interest, and new money must be created to pay that interest. Well, this is only true if you have a debt-based system. Think about it. If the total money stock is a debt, then clearly paying that debt comes from somewhere outside of this bunch of money. So that's true, but it's not true under a gold standard. Gold is not borrowed into existence, it's dug out of the ground, and the total money stock does not command any interest whatsoever. Now, if under the gold standard some borrowing takes place, yeah, that part has to be covered with other gold money. But just for example, and this is a hard concept to get across, and I hope this may help. Let's say we have what I would call this par value of a bond. It's 100 of something, 100 units. Okay? So the bond is borrowed or lent or sold or whatever you will, and then it commands interest while it's in existence, and then it goes back to par. So there's this money, which we call that the principal, and then additional money comes in the interest. Is that okay? Everybody follow that? But that's not how bills work. Bills don't command interest. They're at a discount. They start somewhere under here and end up at par.
Like a zero coupon bond.
Perhaps that's the way to look at it. I mean, I want you to think about this. I don't know all the answers, believe me. But this amount of money, his interest commanded by the bond, but this amount of money is actually added into the system, if you will. So and another thing is that the bill market is huge under the gold standard. So it pretty well offsets the interest, because interest is only commanded by borrowed money, that are equities, and there's cash in circulation. So don't think that interest is wrong because some new money must be created to pay for the interest. That's only true under a borrowed money system. If you've got your total money stock is all borrowed, and this commands interest, then where does the money come from? Well, new money must be created. But with gold, here's gold, and I don't know, maybe this is bonds, and this is bills, and who knows what's here, cash, and so on. So only this part would command interest, and that would come in from the other areas. And the bills part actually frees up money. It frees up gold. Instead of having, this would be the cash, all the cash transactions obviously take place at 100% value. But these are under it, and the bonds are over it. Okay? That's really all I had to say. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the title of my talk this morning is Atlas Shrugged, or When Atlas Shrugged, Lure and Lure of Risk-Free Profits. So first I have to acknowledge my indebtedness to Ayn Rand, who had this marvelous title to his novel, Atlas Shrugged. I just thought this was fitting to say it here because we have a perversion of the system in the bond market. When I refer you to risk-free profits, I have the bond market in mind, bond speculation. And I would like to remind you that under the circumstances of the gold standard, there is no such thing. There is no bond speculation because change in the bond price, which is the reciprocal of changing the rate of interest, is too slow and too small to make speculation profitable. So you don't need legislation to outlaw bond speculation because the gold standard rules it out without any intervention from the government. Bond speculation keeps interest rates relatively stable, and as a consequence, the speculators abandon the field. There is no promise of profits for them. And therefore they go where they can find profitable volatility. Speculation wouldn't exist without volatility. By the way, the same applies to foreign exchange speculation as well. Under the gold standard, the price of foreign exchange, at least of those countries which adhere to the gold standard, is, if not stable, at least very little fluctuation is allowed. the fluctuation is confined to a band. And these are called the gold points, at which point the arbitrageur enters the field. The arbitrageur will prevent the price of foreign exchange to go out of that narrow range. So, but that's not my topic. My topic is the rate of interest and bond speculation. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And in preparation for this, I would like to just set out the tools which I will need to bring in. So the first thing I mentioned, just to make sure, I don't want to offend you that I tell you something which all of you or most of you will be familiar, but just to make sure that we know what we are talking about. I usually talk about the seesaw. Between the interest rate and the bond prices. So I just visualize this type of children's game. One child sits at one end of the seesaw and the other sits at the other end. And the point is that when one of them goes up, the other has to come down and vice versa. And this is rigid. No leads and lags. This is instantaneous. The relationship is mathematical. So we are talking about the rate of interest and the bond price. They are in this relationship, rigid mathematical relationship. There is a mathematical formula called the bond equation. Which I'm not going to write down, but you can take my word for it that if you analyze it, in some cases, some extreme cases, it's straightforward. You look at the equation, immediately see that's the seesaw. But in some cases, it could be a more complicated formula involving infinite series or some other higher mathematics, in which case it's not immediately obvious, but the mathematician knows how to analyze it and how to prove in a few lines that indeed that's a seesaw. So we just have to accept this, and this is not controversial. Even stockbrokers are familiar with it, and they don't question it. And even government officials and central bank officials know about it, and they don't question it. So this is uncontroversial, and this is one of the things I'm going to build on. So this is one thing I wanted to mention before I come to discussing risk-free profits. Here's another thing which I have been writing about and lecturing about for the past 10 years, and I must add with very little success. So I will set you up as the judge whether my critiques and in sometimes vicious critique are justified or not. The topic is the destruction of capital. And I will set it into the context of the present great financial crisis. To my mind, all the ad hoc explanations are out. That's Latin. Ad hoc means that you supply an explanation which fits just the narrow circumstances applicable to that. So, for example, in the case of the great financial crisis, they called it subprime lending, subprime mortgages. That's what landed the world into that crisis, which then had effects in other countries, started from the United States, and it had effects in the financial world elsewhere as well. This is an ad hoc explanation to my mind, because there is a much more general theory which fits the pattern, and which would be, if you really want to understand. You see, the problem with ad hoc explanations, it may explain part of the problem, but it won't give you the big picture. If you want to see the big picture, you need a more general understanding, a more general theory, which will then light up and focus in, light up what the problem is and the understanding, what we can learn from it. So I cross this out because that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a theoretical insight. Just plain insight and the big picture. And I have found it in the general destruction of capital in the world, which is caused by falling interest rate structure. And a little historical reminder, it started in the early 1980s. Already in 1980. But in 1981, interest rates. So I would prefer to answer your questions during the question and answer period. Please write down your questions. I'll be very happy to take time out. I'm already short of time a little bit because Rudy chipped me. I'm not saying that this is. I'm happy to do. But if we open up for a discussion, then I will never be able to finish what I want to say. So please don't be offended. Just write down what your question is. Don't forget. So in the 1980s, already in 1980, 1981, interest rates shot up to, in the case of short-term interest rates, the highest I remember was 22%. Fed fund rate. Basically my examples come from the US experience. It was different in other countries, but basically the same story unfolded elsewhere. On the long-term interest rate, the highest I recall having seen in the 30-year maturity US Treasury bonds, 16%. Well, that's extremely high. And also the interesting thing is that the short rate is higher than the long, which is suggesting the inversion of the yield curve. I will come back to this. There are two types, the normal and the inverted. The logical thing is the normal yield curve, which makes short-term rates lower than long-term rates, and that stands to reason. It's very logical because there is more risk involved to putting out your capital at an interest for a longer period of time. More untoward things could happen in the long run than in the short run. So that's the natural. But when the financial system is under extreme stress, as it was in the early 1980s, the yield curve gets inverted, which shows up in the higher short rates than in the long rates, and sometimes very significantly higher. After all, this is 6% higher. So I think this was really unprecedented event, and this lasted for a couple of years. It's not important just how long it lasted, but the point is that after that, so say after 1982 or 83, the interest rates started falling. So that's almost 30 years ago, well, say it's more than 15 years ago. And it is still lasting, it's still happening. Although I have seen big headlines that proof of hyperinflation is here because the Treasury bond rates, 30-year maturity, shot up from 2.6 to 2.75. Big deal. But we are talking about a terrific range. So it's not a proof that we have seen the end of this falling interest rate. I'm still convinced that it's going to continue. The seesaw is still going in that direction, which is the opposite to this, that rate of interest are perhaps not very high. In fact, they are historically very low, but there's still room for them to come down, which means the bond price is increasing. And that will be crucial when I come to discussing risk-free profits, because the bond speculators are convinced and they are betting on higher bond prices. In spite of the dollar being destroyed under their nose by the government itself and the central bank itself, they still believe that higher long-term bond prices are in the store. And don't call them irrational, because these people put their money where their mouth is. In other words, they believe, they make a living out of betting right. If they bet wrong, they lose their capital and they're out of business and they're finished. So this is very important to see that these guys are not propagandists. They want to make a living. They don't want to make losses. So the point I'm making is that at around this time, there has started a falling trend in the rate of interest. Of course, it was not a straight fall, it was zigzag, but the trend is very, very clear. On the charts, you will see that. And here we are, 2010, and to my mind, there's no, the end isn't, we don't see the end. I mean, you may persuade yourself that this is the end. Usually people say that how much below zero can interest rates fall? But this is the wrong question to ask. The right question to ask, how many times can you have the rate of interest? I think yesterday we did cover this, Rudy did a good job on that this can continue indefinitely. If you say, how many times can you decrease the rate of interest by 0.5%, obviously you sooner or later hit zero. But that's the wrong question. The right question is, how many times can you have the interest rate? So if you start from 16%, first halving gives you 8, second 4%, and then 2% and 1%, and 0.5% and 0.25%, and this goes on indefinitely. And each halving hits the economy like a hammer, hits it badly and does a lot of damage, like the wrecker's ball. And this is what I'm trying to advocate, that every time when the interest rate is being cut, there is a tremendous hit on society's capital structure. The capital structure, which is so much of it is physical, it's invested into tools and buildings and equipment and plants where the production takes place, and so much of it is financial capital of banks, insurance companies, and other financial institutions. So this is very important for us to see that society is very vulnerable because the whole picture has been politicized. The interest rate is a football, and the governments and the banks and the central bank and others who are close to the power centers kick the interest rate. And all the contacts or connection with economic fundamentals are more or less eliminated. And another thing comes in, which is the incredible ignorance on the part of central bankers and government officials and university economists that the falling interest is good for you. It's good for the economy. It's good for business. Businessmen can borrow at a lower rate. So how can you, meaning myself, be so stupid to suggest that this is destroying capital? It's just what the green shoots need, the watering to make them grow faster. And this is completely wrong, and I've been trying for 10 years to put that idea through, and as I have suggested already, either no success or very, very little success. So let's see how you will react to my theory. So this is a fact, a historical fact, that for some 30 years we have had this falling trend for interest rates, and completely wrong interpretation has been put on that fact by the governments. The mistake the governments and academic economists and central bankers are making is that they confuse two entirely different things. They confuse low and stable interest rate structure on the one hand, and a falling interest rate structure on the other. Now, a low and stable interest rate structure is good for the economy. That's a good guy. But a falling interest rate structure is lethal. I don't want to take out too much time to explain why this is so, but I think Rudy will help me here to elaborate on perhaps the shortest explanation. But basically what is involved is what effect a falling interest rate will have on the debt burden. Okay? Those business entities, and those governments, and those individuals, yes, who carry a debt load, they are exposed to the effect of changes in the interest rate. Certain changes will make their burden easier to carry, and certain others will make it far more burdensome to carry. The question is which? And of course what I'm suggesting here is that a falling interest rate paradoxically, because I'm not denying that this is paradoxical, I'm just saying it is true whether you see the reasons immediately or you don't. This is just a fact of life which you have to accept. That is, paradoxically, a falling interest rate structure makes the debt burden, what does it make it, the debt burden? To increase, not decrease. That's paradoxical, just the other, what most people would expect. And now why is that so?
Would you like me to give the example?
Yeah.
Would you like me to give the example? Sure.
Yes, please.
We touched on this quickly yesterday. If a company borrows $1 million at 8%, they have to pay $80K per year for this $1 million in capital, right? So they presumably borrow $1 million and build a plant, build some machinery, or buy cattle for their herd, whatever it is that they're investing in, and start their business. Now interest rates go to 4%. Falling. Somebody can come along and borrow $1 million and end up paying $40K per year for their capital.
So in other words, the first guy gets less and less competitive, and the new guys are more competitive. However, they are exposed because that's not the end of the falling.
If it goes to 2%, the new competitor comes along and pays $20K. another new competitor. So gradually the old ones are put out of business. They cannot compete. So say, well, so what? New companies arise. That's okay. Except new companies arise in China. I know. My company arose in China, and there's no way it's coming back. Once this reverses, it's not coming back because of other reasons. So this is the critical point. And the cost of, if they want to refinance, some people, we did some lectures, said, well, they would refinance. But what do they have to do? They have to pay back this debt. And if it's borrowed, and it brings 80,000 per year, when interest rate drops to 4%, the equivalent borrowing would have to be 2 million. 2 million at 4% equals 80K term, right? So, they have to pay back not 1 million, but 2 million. It's not going to happen. And if the rates go down here, it would take 4 million of borrowing to generate the 80K return. So they have to pay back 4 million. Is that okay? Everybody clear with that?
Could you just run that by me again?
Absolutely. If I'm an investor, I want to generate cash flow. I go out and buy $1 million bond at 8%, I get $80,000.
Yep.
Rates go to 4%.
I understand where new companies have an interest rate advantage which puts the old one out, but then when you said it requires double the amount of money paid back.
That's where I'm going.
That's where I lost it.
That's where I'm going. I'm an investor now. I'm going to lend, you're the company and I'm lending you money.
Yep.
Here's $1 million, pay me 80,000 a year.
Yep.
Done? Okay. Rates go to 4%. Now if I want to generate $80,000 return, I have to buy a $2 million bond, new bond. Okay?
Yep.
So that old bond, which still generates at this rate, is now worth this. Because the market equals up according to this. Is that okay?
Yep.
So you've got to look at both sides, the investor and the one who's going to use that investment. So every time, and this goes on, like Professor says, forever. Well, probably at some point it's going to stop, but we don't really know when. But if it goes from 2% to 1%, then we're already up to $8 million. You know? And the interesting thing is, from here to here, there's a 4 percentage point drop. It just, you know, here, it's only a 1 percentage point drop. So you drop from 2 to 1, but in the meantime, the price doubles. Because the price doubles as per the ratio, not as the actual percentage differences. That makes sense?
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Question?
I think that's not.
Okay.
As I said, there's one thing I could add to that. The investor gets the capital gain. That capital gain comes from the borrower's capital loss. It doesn't come out of thin air.
Yeah, that's true. The holder of this bond has doubled his equity. When the rates go from 8 to 4, he now holds $2 million, a bond that's worth $2 million in the market. So where did that $1 million come from? It came from the producer, the guy who's going out of business.
It's like invisible siphoning off the capital.
Yes.
You see, you are a producer, you have invested in your capital, but there are invisible little pipes stuck into your capital, and they, every time when the interest rate structure falls, they siphon off your capital. And this is unobtrusive. You won't notice it until it's too late, until your capital has been destroyed to the extent that the company can no longer be saved. So this is something which the official economic knowledge as it exists at the government level, at the central bank level, and at the university level is completely ignoring this effect. And I think really emphasizes what I want to call your attention to, it, that it's not really a pendulum, that okay, what you lost here at this end of the pendulum, you recoup and because the pendulum hasn't stopped, because this is a cumulative thing. True enough, there's a zigzag. However, when interest rates have a temporary reversal, you don't recover your lost capital, because in the meantime, we are talking about physical capital goods, there is such a thing as capital maintenance. So if you do not maintain capital, then it has its natural erosion, wear and tear. Well, even if you don't use the capital there's obsolescence, there is the new competition brings in new devices, better devices, and so on. So this is an irreversible process, and we are fully justified in calling it capital destruction. It's not a temporary reversal or temporary setback, which will reverse itself later on as we go along, because once the capital is eroded, it's gone. Capital is like a living organism. You cannot abuse it, because if you do, it will die or will get sick to the extent that there is no recovery possible. And this is the important thing to see, and this is what the central banks, the government economists, and the academic economists do not want to see, or do. I don't know, I don't understand. Honestly, I've tried, as I suggested to you, for 10 years to put this idea, long before any sign of the great financial crisis. I was trying to call attention to the fact that capital has been eroded since the early 1980s, and this is a process which will end in a disaster. Of course, I didn't see what shape and form that disaster would ultimately take. Now, it did come, and then, of course, all the media and the academic economists and others started talking about the irresponsibility of banks, the subprime loans, subprime mortgages, etc. Now, please do not misunderstand. I have no sympathy whatever for the bankers any more than other people. I know they are guilty of several counts, many, it's a long list. But in this instance, you cannot blame the crisis on them, because they have a partial responsibility. Of course, they benefited from this to the extent that their capital, the bankers' capital, is invested in financial instruments. Could be bonds, notes, bills, and other type of instruments which benefit from a falling interest rate structure to the extent of the seesaw. Because as interest rates are falling, the prices of these instruments into which their capital is invested is rising. So this is good for them. They are benefiting from it. But they did not create it. That's way beyond the power of the bankers. This is the deep down cause is really Keynesian economics, because Keynes was the one who suggested that interest rates are an artificial creation. There is no such thing as scarcity of capital. If you print the money, that means you can print capital, because with the money you buy the capital. And therefore just ignore interest rates, ignore any long-term effects of falling interest rates, because the government can always print capital by printing money, which is a terrible idea. But that's what's behind it, really. that there's a mindset of the whole of majority of society who see the falling interest rate as a blessing, even now when it is an extremely low level in historical terms, the interest rate structure, and they still call for quantitative easing and lower interest rates. In fact, that's announced by Bernanke himself, that the purpose of the exercise in QE 1 and 2 is to push down interest rates even lower, to perk up the interest of businessmen and other investors to start spending. But how can they when the capital is being destroyed at the same time, simultaneously? So this is a terrible, terrible historical mistake that Keynes came along at the time when he started preaching these doctrines. The world was frustrated. The economy, high unemployment, businesses were at the verge of collapse, and some of them did collapse, and even the sound businesses did collapse. So the world listened to him and swallowed it lock, stock, and barrel, everything, hook and sinker, right? That's the proper explanation. And now, so many years after Keynes is gone, after all, he died in 1947, so that's well over half a century, and they still parrot these slogans. Keynes ignored capital. He was thinking in terms of capital is really in the hands of the government, because it's the capitalist who makes capital scarce. Capital is not scarce, it's free for the picking. The government has to set up a system whereby capital can be created simply by printing money. And we are all suffering from this vicious and very bad theory 60 years after he died. So this is the reason. Now, I'm going to, how is time? I don't know.
10 minutes.
10 more minutes? Very good. So I want to say something about risk-free speculation in bonds, because you don't understand that very corrosive process without bringing in speculation. Please do not misunderstand. I certainly believe that speculation has a place in the economy, and especially when it comes to risks which are given by nature, inherent in nature, such as risks in connection with producing agricultural goods. That's a very good example, because it depends on the weather, on natural disasters, on the absence of them, such as earthquakes, floods, and typhoon, and you can name it, it's all a risk. And therefore, we don't know the future, and there is no scientific way of predicting what effect these outside factors will have on the crop. And also remember that a good crop benefits the consumer because it brings about lower prices, but a poor crop will benefit the producer because it brings about higher prices, but at the same time hurts the other. So what we would ideally need is a system which cuts down on the extreme swings which production would have in the complete absence of speculation, because any great damage to the crop would hurt the consumer but help the producer, help in quotation mark, and vice versa. Now, when speculation comes in, and that's really the only antidote we have to compensate for nature's capriciousness. Nature is capricious, and we cannot compensate for that using science, because we don't see the future. But we still have something. We have speculation, and speculation does a good job, which we more or less understand, but really there is something as a sixth sense the speculators seem to have, at least those who survive, because very few of them survive, go into speculation. A lot of them lose their capital, and they are wiped out. And better speculators step into their place. And we just understand that they have a kind of sixth sense. So they divine what changes in the weather pattern of this or that will adversely affect the crops, or affect them on the positive side. And then they are rewarded handsomely, because, for instance, they expect a bumper crop, then they start selling short before the bumper crop becomes a known fact. And when prices actually start falling, when everybody else realizes what happened, then they profit, because they were short, so they can cover their short at a lower price, and that's their profit. And vice versa. If they expect a poor crop or even a complete elimination of a crop, which happens occasionally, then they will keep buying up the supplies. The biblical story of Joseph comes to mind, who interpreted the dream of the Pharaoh properly. The Pharaoh saw in his dreams 7 sleek and fat cows, and on the one hand, and 7 rickety cows. And what happened? The rickety cows devoured the fat ones, and nobody could make sense of that. Joseph did, and he predicted that this means that 7 plentiful years will be followed by 7 lean years, and he even had the answer what to do. Stockpile the cheap at the cheap price, the grain and other commodities in preparation for the 7 lean years. And this, in fact, is how it turned out. And the Pharaoh appointed him as the czar of distribution. You see, the thing is that when prices are low, people are liable to use goods wastefully, because they're so cheap. Grain is cheap, so you feed some to the pigs and so on. But if you had known that the 7 fat years will be followed by lean years, you could have found a better use for the surplus grain. You would have stored them, and when the 7 lean years come, then you start distributing the surplus. And that's the way to do it. So the Bible itself tells you that speculation is a positive thing. But there is a but. And the but is that the risk which the speculator addresses has to do with risks created by nature. Because if you are talking about risk created by man, then it's not speculation really, it's gambling. That's what the gambling houses are. The risks are created by the owner of the casino, and people flock in and they make bets, and that is not speculation, that is gambling. But how many people realize that when the government takes over and says, we are going to control foreign exchange rates, we are going to control interest rates, we are going to control prices, and so on, that this is no longer a risk created by nature, it's a risk created by man. Now, these men happen to be in the government. That doesn't change the nature of the game. It's still an artificially created risk. And the whole theory of speculation, which is valid for risks that were created by nature, will be invalidated for the risk created by man. And that's as simple as that. And that is not being realized by economics. I have checked out a very large part of the economic literature trying to find distinction, that if anybody made a distinction between artificially created risks and risk created by nature. And I didn't find any. I'm not saying there isn't any because I couldn't possibly check everything. But the major ones I certainly checked and there was nothing. Speculation is speculation, period. And the exponents of Keynesianism were saying that there is really no difference. When they open up the future market for bonds, that's just like having a future market for wheat or corn or any other agricultural commodity. But there's a very big difference, because if you have a future market for bonds, then you are making a confrontation possible between the central bankers and the bond speculators. No natural risk is involved, it's just the wits which are competing here. The wits of the central bankers and the wits of the bond speculators. But, ladies and gentlemen, I'm asking you, a central banker is working for a salary, right? Right. Maybe bonuses, right? Right. But the bond speculator is putting his whole capital at risk. So where do you find the smartness? Where do you find the intellectual capacity? Those who get their salary anyhow, or those who, when they fail, they are wiped out and they are out of the game? They have to go back to the labor force. Well, it is pretty obvious to me that by the nature of things, all the wits are on the side of speculators and the dullness on the part of the hired hands. Central bank hires these traders and they work for a salary. Now, there are exceptions, of course, but the point is that the dull trader on the part of the central bank will survive. and the dull bond speculator will not. We wiped out, short order. So, in an evolutionary situation, you end up with a bunch of dull-witted employees of the central bank and a lot of very, very smart and high-witted and sharp speculators who know what to do and who can easily outsmart. Just like George Soros, who wrote a book that he one-handedly put the Bank of England, of all banks, made them lose money. He was betting heavily against the British pound, and he was right, and he won billions, and he couldn't keep his mouth shut. I mean, normally you would say, well, I'm lucky this time, so let me keep quiet. But no, he had to write a book and tell the world that here I single-handedly defeated the Bank of England at this game. Now, I guess it's time to call for a break, and after the break I will say a few more things and then open the floor for discussion. Thank you. They are not even trying to hide the fact that they want to create inflation, and the way they go about it is to push down the interest rates even more. Now, there's not much room for pushing at the short end of the yield curve, so they are going to do the pushing the long end, where the long-term treasury bonds in the United States are still fetching something like 2.5% per annum. But this is a mistake they make. They think that they create inflation, and in fact they are creating deflation. And to see that even more, I'm going to put it into the context of risk-free speculation in bonds. Why they can make this mistake? It's a capital mistake. It's because they are blind to speculation, or they have a distorted view of speculation. But we can see it more clearly if we follow the following two possible scenarios. In actual fact, there could be a mixture of the two scenarios I'm going to present here, and there might be some different inputs too, but basically you can understand the situation if you consider these two scenarios. The first scenario is depicted on this chart. This is the yield curve, the normal yield curve, which starts from 0 and it increases. It has an asymptotic limit. The asymptotic limit means that this horizontal line is being approached but never reached. The curve is getting closer and closer but never reaches it. And this would correspond to what in Britain was called the console. In North America, it's more often called a perpetual bond. The bond which never matures. They issue it and they pay the annual interest, but the bond never matures. It's in perpetuity. It's really an abstraction. It wasn't in Britain because consoles were trading. There was an active market for them. But in North America, perpetual bonds always existed as an abstraction. And this is not important. I just mentioned for the benefit of those who have heard about the term perpetual bond. The yield the annual yield of the perpetual bond is this asymptotic limit, the dotted line here. Now, when this normal yield curve is given, then bond speculators come in and start doing their business, which yesterday we called illicit interest arbitrage. In other words, borrowing short in order to lend long. So that means, for instance, that they would sell, a bond speculator would sell a very short maturity paper, could be 1 month, 2 months, whatever, and with the proceeds, he would buy a longer term instrument. But you see, this is costing him a very low interest payment, and he's collecting a higher one. So the difference between the two rates, perhaps it's better seen here at this level, this is his profit. He was selling this maturity and buying, he was selling this maturity and buying this one, and the difference between the two rates is his profit. He pockets it. This is illegitimate because he didn't perform any useful service to society or anybody. In fact, it's a very harmful kind of activity, because if too many people are doing that, ultimately it will result in a reversal, and the yield curve becomes inverted, which means that the short rates shoot up, showing the distress in the financial system, and in comparison, the long-term rates will be lower. So they lose their shirt, but that's the smaller problem. The bigger problem is society is holding the bag, because this is a panic situation, and it will cause economic disruptions in production, in the financial world, and so on. So this should be avoided at all costs, and rather than ruling this out, the central banks and the government are even encouraging this kind of activity. I will come to this in a moment. So this is what you have, and usually they tell you in the courses on economics and finance that the central bank really controls only the very short rate of interest. The central bank is neither in the business nor has the power to control the long term. And this is, of course, wrong, because the central bank, when it goes into the market and buys the short-term rate of interest, this will buys the bill. Okay? The central bank, in order to increase the money supply, the most important tool which the central bank has to do this is to go into the bill market and buy treasury bills. And this puts money into circulation, and this is additional money. This is going to increase the money supply. But that's not the end of the story, because it starts a chain reaction. This is pushed down a little, so that creates a profitable spread, which then one type of bond speculator will exploit and will sell this to the central bank and buy this. And then there is a corresponding effect here, creating another widened spread. So another group of bond speculators will exploit this, and then it will just start this wave, and ultimately it will end up in a general lowering, or sometimes they say flattening the yield curve. And it goes on, and then it reaches a point where the apple cart is upset, and then the short-term rates shoot up, and you have an inverted yield curve. So that's what happens. So there's no such thing as an isolated central bank intervention which will control the low rate of interest, usually pushes it down, because it will shoot through the whole yield curve, having this effect, and ultimately it causes a panic. Now, the whole idea of the government managing the economy is based on this fact that of Keynes, which was first openly spelled out by Keynes himself, that the government can push down the short-term rate of interest, and this is creating money, and more money will then do its beneficial effect on the economy. It's like oiling, keep machinery well oiled, and then they use the term make the stone into bread and the water into wine. I think that's in Keynes somewhere. That the government has to overcome the scarcity of capital, printing money, and this will lower interest rates, and that's the way to turn stone into bread and water into wine for the benefit of everybody. Well, what he forgot about was the speculation, because speculators do come into the picture, and remember, this is the type of speculation where speculators address what kind of risks? Natural risks or artificial risks? Artificially created, because the whole situation was set up by the government. The government pushed down this short end of the yield curve, and that created that stepwise flattening of the yield curve. So that's scenario number one. But there is also scenario number two. And under this scenario, the speculators, who are extremely astute and smart people, I have to give them all the admiration for their skills, because they know their business. They know their business. And make no mistake, if they don't, they'll be out in no time at all. The market will eliminate them. Market will grab their capital, and they'll be out of money, and that's the end of their career as a speculator. So the bond speculators makes it his business to study Keynes and others, Mises and Austrian and non-Austrian and everything, and come to the conclusion that here, in order to run the economy and run the monetary system, it depends on one big fact. before any other facts of smaller importance. And that one big fact is that the Fed, or the central bank, has a periodic need to make the trip to the open market and buy the paper, buy the government bond or bill or whatever instrument. And they may false card also to try to cover up their tracks. So sometimes they also sell. But if you take an average over a long period of time, it's just buying, not buying. Because that's how the money supply is made to grow. The money they create out of nowhere, out of the thin air, and buy the bonds in the open market, buy the bills in the open market, and thereby the money supply is increased, and then they just sit back and wait for the economy to boom, which it will, but at a cost. But that's another story. So there it is. The speculators know that there is a periodic need for the central bank to make that trip. Because if they don't, then the economy, in their view, will not grow. So all the speculator has to do is to have intelligence. Either inside information which they can buy from employees, or just use simple common sense. And they know when the Fed is buying, because that they are in the market, it's in the open market. So the Fed can try to confuse the issue by false carding and this and that and other method, but basically it will be very clear. So if the speculators realize that the Fed hasn't bought for a long time, they know that time is now approaching, and they anticipate and forestall the Fed, and they buy before the Fed is buying. Before, that's the important thing, because then prices are cheaper. And they know that when the Fed enters the market, then the prices will increase, and then they can unload. So they buy before the Fed buys, and then they turn around and sell to the Fed, which is coming in as a buyer. And it is risk-free profit. Ladies and gentlemen, make no mistake about it, this profit is risk-free, or as close to risk. There's risk even involved when you cross the street from one side to the other, as we all know. So risk-free is an abstraction, but it's as close to risk-free as it is possible to do. And it's not even unknown to the Fed itself. The Fed realizes that with a better technique, buying technique, it could buy cheaper. But the Fed does need the bond speculator. See, that's the whole point. There is a symbiosis. The speculators are not considered as pests. They look at this relationship as a symbiotic relation. Or if I want to want to call a spade, I would say the Fed is paying bribe money to the speculators to come into the bond market and make it liquid enough so that they can put their monetary policy into effect. So they are not that stupid to assume that things are natural, because they create this artificial situation where risk-free profits can be picked up. But between profits where you put your capital at risk and profits which you can earn risk-free, there is a difference which is the same as difference between night and day. Because if the speculator puts his capital at risk, then he can earn a profit only to the extent of his very superior intelligence and foresight. But if the speculation becomes risk-free or getting close to it, then it's a different ball game, because it doesn't matter how small the profit is, how close to zero the profit is. If you multiply it with a very large number, then it becomes substantial. And that's what's happening. The speculators, because the bond speculators, because the speculation is risk-free or virtually risk-free, can do it a very high number of times, and then they end up with positive gains. Now, these are two scenarios, and you can have a blend of the two approaches, and the outcome is always the same. On balance, interest rates fall, and the policymakers at the Fed and the government simply assume that falling interest rates is the same as the increase in the money supply, so it's inflationary. But that's where they make the worst mistake. I think it's the worst mistake science has ever made when Keynes, they followed Keynes slavishly, and that's what Keynes actually said. What in fact happens is that as interest rates fall, the seesaw effect will make bond prices buoyant. They will have a natural tendency to go higher, and they do go higher, and that's also how long-term speculators in long-term treasury bonds make a profit. They buy the bond and they expect the price to go higher, and when they are higher, they sell. Or they do this continuously, or do it through the futures market, do it through the options market, and so on. There are various different ways. But the basic idea is they can buy the bond before the Fed buys, and they turn around and dump it into the lap of the Fed, and the Fed knows this, understands this, but they expect a different outcome from what actually happens. Because as interest rates keep falling, then this effect takes place. There is a destruction of capital involved, which affects everybody. It affects the banks themselves. They are not aware of that, but it does affect them. And if you put all these components and try to see the big picture, then you will realize that that's what's ailing our economy. And it's an extremely dangerous game, because the end of it is not just deflation and destruction of capital, meaning businesses are folding or being exported to low-wage countries, but also it is unemployment and breakdown in law and order, and ultimately, I think our own civilization is at risk. And therefore, we should be aware of what's going on, that this is an avenue which is advertised, jazzed up, advertised and promoted as being the right way to prosperity, but it is actually the right way to hell. So with this I finish my presentation, and I ask Louis to come here and take questions from the floor. No, okay. Thank you.
You had a question this morning during the
Yes.
We're talking about the destruction of capital. So this is, we're referring to here, just to make it clear, this is going to be fiat capital exclusively and unsound money.
No, all capital. Physical capital, financial capital, including fiat, but there is such a thing as a good, solid financial capital, right? I mean, surely, insurance companies.
Well, I mean as far as paper money versus chunks of gold. If we have paper money in one hand, gold in the other hand, we can destroy the value of the paper money this way, but does that destroy the value of the capital value of the gold?
Now gold is not in that scheme. Gold is not in that scheme. Gold is special for one reason only, which is that gold is the ultimate extinguisher of debt. That's what makes gold separate from everything else. Financial capital, physical capital, commodities, everything. Gold is different because that's the ultimate extinguisher of debt. So if you want to bring in gold, then you have to widen your net a little bit and go through. But for the sake of simplicity, I left out gold from this.
Does this then perhaps push up the price of gold because the destruction of the other capital of gold is maybe holding its value?
Is the end result or the direction of all this not having the effect of increasing the price of gold?
It has, or
What would you say that one consequence is that the price of gold is decreasing?
Well, the price of gold is not increasing the same way as this. You recall the history. This is about a 30-year story, and this is unmistakable, a down-sloping channel. But if you recall what the gold price did during the same period of time, you will see that first it did go down, but the past 10 years was different. So gold made a turnabout when this didn't show any sign of turning around. So if you want to set up a one-to-one correspondence between the gold price and this, then it's not going to work, or not going to work very well. However, the ultimate outcome should be very clear, because these, if one inversion of the yield curve doesn't do the trick, then there will be several of those. Each is worse than the previous. These are panics. And then there is a recovery, and then there's another panic which is worse, and this could repeat itself several times. And ultimately, the monetary system is going to collapse. And that's what brings gold back into the picture. I will have a lot more to say about gold in the subsequent lectures. But here, I am not really trying to bring in gold, because this would unnecessarily complicate the picture, which is otherwise, it's difficult as it is, but if I bring in gold, it will be even more difficult.
Just maybe a word before I ask you to ask a question is, from experience of attending professors' lectures, any question related to the future price of gold will be answered in a manner that doesn't avoid the question, but tries to explain more fundamentally. Gold's value is its weight. in itself. The price
Intrinsic.
the price is in a fiat currency that is going down or may continue to go down. Therefore, that's why
So the gold price is just an image,
is a result.
reflection.
What matters is to possess ounces.
Yeah, I was just wanting to clarify that I've got the point. You're saying that the injection of counterfeit capital by the Fed is essentially results in transferring real resources to bond speculators, and that's the real malinvestment that's causing the destruction of capital. If you like, that's the consumption of the seed corn. Is that the point? Have I got that right?
Can you start that again? Or do you want Julian? You go again.
Okay, just trying to clarify that I've got the point. Are you saying that the injection of counterfeit capital by the Fed, this whole process here, is it your point that results in transferring real resources, if you like the seed corn, results in transferring that to the bond speculators, and that's the consumption of capital? Is that the essential point? That's the malinvestment?
This question is about where is the link between the Fed's open market operations and the destruction of capital.
Where's the link?
Where is the link?
Well, the link is not the important thing, because destruction of capital would take place also if the declining rate of interest is brought about by some other forces. And I'm not prepared to give an example, but let's assume that for some natural reason interest rates keep falling for a couple of years. Then the destruction of capital will still take place. You see? And therefore, the problem is first to understand this process. Now, when the Fed comes in, that becomes an artificial input, a force which will cause the capital destruction. And the reason they don't see it themselves, the government economists and the central bank, because they have no understanding of the process of speculation, especially this risk-free type of speculation, what result it will bring about. So that's the way I try to explain it.
Can I
Sure.
give my take on it anyway? The name of the game is to maintain interest rates low or keep pushing them down, and the Federal Reserve does that in the way that Professor explained. The consequence of capital being destroyed resides on the balance sheets of companies, in that the liabilities are not marked to market. The debt that companies have, the liquidation value of the debt, the company, let's say a company has $1 million of debt, and that debt is payable at 10%, but now interest rates are at 5%. The present value of that obligation is more than $1 million.
I don't follow that, okay?
Well, Rudy tried to explain it earlier on because.
I follow it either.
Here.
But here's another. Anyway.
No, that same example. If the interest rate drops from 10 to 5% overnight, and the company which issued the bond would like to get out of that, they would have to go into the market and repurchase their bonds. But it will cost them twice as much.
But if they don't wish to extinguish it, if they wish to pay back at the normal term, there's no...
I know, and this is what the accounting profession professes. Because there is no desire to pay it early, there is no need to mark it the market. But that is why the capital destruction happens without anybody noticing. Because implicitly, by not repaying the debt now, they are less competitive than someone coming in, borrowing the same amount of money. And therefore, the cost of operating their business, relatively speaking, in the rest of the economy is greater than for a competitor. So I think marking to market is a principle that the professor's written some fantastic papers on that. I would like to get them published and get the accounting profession to respond, but it's impossible to get them published. But here's the thing. We mark to market assets, but we don't mark to market liabilities. Where's the logic in that? I fully concur with you that a company that would out of debt will have no desire to do so if it costs them twice as much to get out of the debt now. But think of it this way: the extra cost of getting out of it now is just the present value of what they'll ultimately pay, more than if they just refinance now.
Could you mention that if half of the plant burns down, a factory, then the accountants cannot possibly pretend that nothing bad happened. Let's assume that the insurance pays only for a fraction of the damage. The chartered accountant, which carries the books, will have to record that loss as a loss. And they have to make up for this loss by charging the stream of profits until they have accumulated enough so they can write off the loss. Now, if it's not a fire or a physical destruction of capital, but it's a drop of interest rates from 10 to 5%, the chartered accountant says, so what? Too bad. Act of God, right? But you see, the fire could be act of God, and they still have to do something about it.
Here, I'm sorry to expand on this, but it's a terribly difficult concept to grasp, and I've struggled for a long time. That's why I'm happy to try and give you my take on it. But here's another example of how capital is destroyed on company balance sheets. Take depreciation. Depreciation of capital, machinery that a company buys to operate its business. Accounting profession has many methods of depreciating capital over time, but they're all linear, or pretty much. They don't take interest into account. And that's fundamentally because the underlying assumption of all the accounting principles is stable interest rates, or stable monetary.
Regardless how volatile.
Regardless of what we've got. So, but in effect, if a machine is bought at 10 million and only 2 million has been depreciated, it will sit on the balance sheet at, or let's say 5 million has been depreciated. It sits on the balance sheet at 5 million because there is still 5 million based on the original depreciation schedule to be taken off. But interest rates have collapsed or dropped a lot significantly during that time, so the present value of those remaining 5 years of further depreciations has gone up. So the asset value should go down, which again has the effect on the balance sheet of depleting capital if you balance things out.
You've got a further problem with depreciating things on accounting schedules is the fact that with the inflation in the money supply, the real replacement cost of that item of plant is way above what the depreciation. So you're running a depreciation schedule that doesn't take into account the real effective cost of replacing that item. So what shows in the balance sheet isn't a present-day reality of the cost of replacement plant.
Yeah, well, I was just talking about nominal capital. I guess you're talking about real inflation-adjusted capital.
Makes it worse.
It makes it worse.
If you can buy the capital at a lower interest rate,
Yeah.
you can buy the capital with debt at a lower interest rate, a new player could enter the market and buy the brand new equipment at a higher price but at a lower interest and still be more competitive than the guy that's got it.
Exactly.
Professor, this is
really more of a philosophical or abstract question, I suppose. But earlier in discussing the legitimacy of speculation regarding natural risk or nature-based risk versus man-made risk, you pointed to the biblical story of Joseph and the 7 years of plenty versus scarcity. And I just wanted to ask your perspective on the biblical issue of usury or interest as it's more commonly described in today's world. It is, of course, between the major religions of the world a point of difference or contention. And arguably, so many problems go back to, all debt is traceable to borrowing and interest in today's world. So what would your perspective be on the biblical issue of usury?
Well, I think I got that question very clearly. The question of usury goes back, way back, well before the Christianity originated. And what happened was Aristotle, who is celebrated today as one of the greatest philosophers, but actually he was betraying his own teacher, Plato. And he made an enormous number of mistakes in physical sciences and ethical sciences and so on. And one of the mistakes he made, the original sin of Aristotle, was to say that my Latin is a little bit rusty, but in English translation it means money does not beget money, or even better, gold does not beget gold. I mean, sheep can beget sheep, cattle can beget cattle, but gold cannot beget gold. Okay? Now this was, of course, a mistake, because it's not gold which begets gold in the sense as sheep beget sheep, but it's in the sense that if you put gold to use as capital, you buy capital equipment and so on, and your husbandry works out nicely, then you end up with a profit, a surplus. And this is not unnatural. Aristotle says it's unnatural. It's taking, because if you borrow, you have no right to, if you lend gold, you have no right to ask for more back at the end of the loan period, because gold does not beget gold, which is wrong, which is contradicted by the facts that good husbandry, yes, does result in a surplus. Now, then, that was almost 2,500 years ago, then Christianity came along, and there was a man who became a saint by the name St. Thomas of Aquinas. And St. Thomas Aquinas, what he did was basically took Aristotle, his teachings, and dressed it up in Christian garb. Lock, stock, and barrel. But Aristotle had lots and lots of mistakes. He had one good point, the Aristotelian logic, which is something we still cherish and should cherish. But a lot of his other conclusions were wrong, plain wrong. And one of them was this. So this got into the Christian theology. But then, give another few centuries, a group of Christian scholars came around who were known by the name of schoolmen, were scholastic philosophers. And they had, and this is not very widely known for some reason. I'm curious myself why this happened, that this is true, but it's not explained. And even the church itself does not advertise these schoolmen. We can put them just at the end of the Middle Ages and beginning of the Renaissance, so the same kind of background which Ficino's school has. The schoolmen were members of a religious order, and they studied philosophy. They made it their business to study. And they came up with the idea of natural profit. They acknowledge that there is a surplus at the end of it. And therefore, if you rent out the means of producing, could be a building you rent, or could be a business, or could be just the land which you can cultivate, then to the extent that you give up means of earning a return yourself, you are entitled for a compensation. So usury to them didn't mean any interest. It meant interest over and above that kind of natural return, which with normal good husbandry, everybody who was industrious enough could earn. And that, only that counted as usury. So also they talked about dry exchange and productive exchange. That meant basically the foreign exchange market, because a lot of entrepreneurs escaped the usury charges by dressing up their books involving a lot of foreign exchange, so that it would be very difficult to track down the interest. They just said we lost on this foreign exchange, so they could hide the profits as a loss, where there was either no loss or much less loss than the books would show. So in other words, the schoolmen did a marvelous job of untangling this very difficult problem, which had a history of over 1,000 years, going back all the way to Aristotle, who was worshipped as God at the time, during the Renaissance, which was a mistake, because you should be very critical when you read Aristotle. So my answer to your question is that it's a very complicated issue. Sometimes it's made overcomplicated. But the fact is that the Roman Catholic Church did come around by the late 19th century. And the Roman Catholic Church advised the confessors not to disturb the penitents who say under confession that they have not only collecting interest was a sin, a mortal sin, but also paying it. So, there were the double. And that was waived. The Catholic Church caved into the teachings of Jean Calvin.
Those were the days,
One reason I ask is that it seems that the company that bought its machinery at 8% in your example might have been much better off of it. Instead of borrowing at interest, they would have brought in equity capital, just sold shares and brought in equity and not incurred debt.
Yes.
They would have diluted their potential profit because they would have owed dividends. But it seems that most business activity, the alternative is there of selling equity versus going into debt.
Yes, that's just it. You see, there are different ways of approaching the same problem, and they might be economically equivalent, but from the ethical point of view, they are different. So I think today this usury issue arises in a very different form than it did. But a much worse problem today is that government interference in economic affairs creates this profit opportunity for speculation, risk-free speculation. Nobody is addressing this. And this is the problem today, that the government creates conditions which will motivate people to devote their talents, and I'm thinking of the very smart speculator. It's a God-given gift that these people have a better grasp of reality in the markets than anyone else. And the government creates conditions which these people could exploit. And then the blame goes to them. The government will blame the bloody speculator. The government will not blame itself and its own economists and Keynes and the rest of them, Friedman and the rest of them, but the speculator, the parasite who is sucking the blood of society, which is quite unjust, because the natural way of things is a society where you don't have risk-free opportunities to speculate. If you are a speculator, you have to face the music, and that's risk, risk, risk. And if you place the wrong kind of bet, you've got to pay. But the government creates a situation which is making this possible, and nobody blames the government. Everybody it's just that simple.
So would you say that you're in favor of usury but not government subsidized usury?
No, another way of putting that.
I'm very sorry.
I have actually postponed the thing, so if you want to continue.
Oh, have you? Oh, thank you. So we can carry on.
I just wanted to add one thing about the advanced state of the cancer with the front-running the Fed. There's a website called Zero Hedge.
Yes.
It has an ongoing discussion, including they publish, a lot of the big banks have identified each specific, it's called QSIP, which bonds that they think the government is going to buy or the Fed is going to buy next. The Fed has announced their schedule of each day that they plan to do this monetization. And so there's this whole speculation on Zero Hedge that they're going to buy this one and this one and this one, and after the end of the Fed open market operation, they have a scorecard. And most of the time they get 90% or 85% or 100%. I mean, these people are nailing it every time.
Yes, and the quantum of QE2 was announced after the Fed consulted with all the participants in terms of how much money they needed. Julian?
One of the big issues in the world of investment at the moment is what is going to happen to the bond market. And I know that because I was writing a letter to Midnight last night on this particular topic, so it's very relevant. So while I don't expect you to say what's going to happen, I'm interested in your views here. One of the themes out there at the moment is that certainly the Federal Reserve or reserve central banks around the world will increase interest rates at some point in time. And also we've seen significant monetary inflation over the last couple of years. I would have thought, and I think this is what some people suggest, is that would lead to rises in yields of bonds over time.
Rises in?
Yields, bond yields.
Yes.
Whereas...
well, practically everybody predicted that.
What will happen in the future is that with all the monetary inflation, and we are likely to see the bond yields may go up, they may go down as well, as you point out. But your thesis here seems to say that despite the monetary inflation which we've seen, we will continue to see a downward trend.
For at least a considerable amount of time, could be a couple of years.
Despite the monetary inflation.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Now, if you want to understand this better, then there was a paper originally published in 1947, and this was published in Canada. And Jackson is the last name, forget the first name of the author, not a well-known name at all. And this economist, originally coming from Britain, but he worked in Canada, is presenting a theory which he called the linkage. And the idea is very simple. The idea is that the price level and the rate of interest are linked, and they are going up and down together. And this linkage is not so rigid as the seesaw, because there are leads and lags. So he used the analogy of two dogs being connected with a leash. And it is possible for one dog to run ahead, but only so far ahead of the other, because then the leash will restrain him. And then perhaps the second dog will go faster and leave the other behind, but again, only so much because of the leash. And then he studied, not only him, but a lot of other economists studied the historical record, because they go back in Europe, the British and the French data goes back to the time of the French Revolution. And it was amazing that this theory, which was really a conjecture at that point, was confirmed by the data. And then somebody by the name Nikolai Kondratyev came along, a Russian under the communist system, and he studied not just two indicators such as the price level and the rate of interest, but he threw in other things such as foreign exchange, wages, rents, etc. I think altogether 22 indicators. And it was the same, that they move with very few exceptions. They move together, up and down, with this leads and lags. Could distort the picture, but the big picture was clear. They moved together. So why is it relevant to your question? It's relevant because then Keynes chimed in too, because he called it
Gibson's paradox?
Yes, that's Gibson, that's it. Thank you, Rudy. Gibson's paradox. Here, the same linkage which in 1947 this Jackson talked about, he contributed to Gibson. And then this was revived fairly recently, say 10 years ago, by the American Summers. Larry Summers, yeah. So he and another author wrote an article. So this all hangs on the same idea that basically there is a linkage between these two indicators, price level. Now, the others noticed it. So this is, but nobody could give an explanation. And well, we are out of time, so I can't go.
No, just the point of clarity. When you say price level in this particular answer, you mean the general price level. You don't mean bond price.
No, commodity prices.
Commodity.
Yes, commodity prices. and not even real estate prices. These are considered as different markets, but broadly a commodity market including agricultural goods, but also minerals and
Real goods.
oil.
Tangible goods.
Tangible goods, yes. So I cannot go into this, but I think I have the answer. We can prove it that there is a linkage. Jackson couldn't, and none of the others. I mean, there were many other economists, including Haberler and some of the Austrians, but they couldn't prove it. They in fact said that this is against all economic insight. But if you shift the view in such a way that you give proper input or proper weight to speculation, then this would follow logically. But this will have to be the subject of another symposium.
Next year.
Next year.
One more question? We have time? Or Julian, did you want to follow up?
That's fine.
Okay. Gold has industrial uses that are fairly trivial. Most of that use is recoverable. Silver has industrial uses that are non-trivial, and much of that use is not recoverable. If we were in a world where we had a commodity currency based on gold, or if we had a different world where we had a commodity currency that was primarily based on silver, how would that affect, what factors would be involved in destruction or preservation of capital in either of those two scenarios?
Well, there would be a variable gold-silver ratio. It would not be fixed. If they fixed it, this would be a similar mistake they made when they introduced the bimetallic monetary system.
I don't want to imply that there's a fixed correlation. If anything, I want to imply that we had one universe where we were primarily or exclusively using gold as a backing for a commodity versus another alternate universe where we were primarily or exclusively using silver.
But you see, the fact that gold has relatively few or unimportant industrial or other uses, such as in the arts or dentistry or wherever, is just a fact of its slowly declining marginal utility. Because if gold was cheaper, then you could think of any number of industrial. You could think of any number of industrial applications. Gold is because it's non-corrosive and it's can be drawn into very, very small wire, smaller than any other. Other metals would break, gold wouldn't, and or hammered out to what's the word, foils, so that you can see through. And in Canada, in Toronto, the Royal Bank is all the glass panes of the windows are covered with a thin wafer, very thin. It's transparent, so thin that you just see the little tint there, but it's as transparent as this window. But it does have the effect that it cuts down on the cost of air conditioning in the summer and the cost of heating in the winter. That's actually an application which has been put into use. When they built that building, gold was a hell of a lot cheaper than it is today. They wouldn't repeat that feat. But my point is that the number of these industrial applications actually depends on the price of gold. Now, the demand for industrial uses competes with the demand for investment uses or insurance purposes or what have you, and the actual balance is brought about the market. So I don't see a great problem there. But it's good, as you pointed out, that silver has a lot to offer, because it is very flexible in this sense that it has lots of industrial applications, but it's coming up as a monetary metal, And in fact, there's no number 2 other than silver. Number 1 is gold, but number 2 is silver. And there's no, if you look for other also rands, you want to, it will be difficult to find them.
I think we'll leave it there. There's probably more questions, and that's going to go on for all week. So if you'd like to join me in thanking the Professor.
You are a great tower of strength. I do say that because, everything what brought me to New Zealand and put me in contact with the right people is thanks to Louis, the great guy.
We meet this afternoon at 219. Just reminding you at 2 p.m.